Hello there, and welcome to this week's episode of Mondays with Matthew. Those of you who watched last week's video will remember that we took on the subject of housing affordability, and that in order to solve what I believe to be a very serious problem, we need to build a lot more new housing, and specifically homes for our nation's first-time buyers. Well, this week we're going to take a deeper dive into the world of these buyers, a vast majority of whom are, you guessed it, millennials. So why do I think that it's so important to figure out how to provide housing for these young buyers? Well, let's start with taking a look at some numbers. Here's a breakdown of the US population by age for two generational cohorts, millennials and Gen Xers. In total, there are a little more than 72 million millennials in the US, and they are the largest generational cohort, actually dwarfing the 65 million Gen Xers. They also outnumber baby boomers too. And as you can see, well, we're also set to see a wave of millennials enter their 30s. And that's a time when many will start to think about marriage and families, and with that, a move out of their current accommodations and into, you guessed it, ownership housing. And all this sounds great, but of course it's a little bit more complex than that. You see, so far, millennials have been holding back from these traditional norms for quite some time, and that raises one big question. Why? And to answer that, we have to understand how different millennials are from other generations. Let's start by looking at the home ownership rate for younger Americans, and you can clearly see that when the housing bubble burst, it hit younger homeowners hard. But in 2006, the oldest millennial was only 25, so the contraction here was from Gen Xers and not millennials. However, once we came out of the recession, we didn't really see any improvement in the home ownership rate amongst millennials for several more years. And even now, the ownership rate for under 35s is where it was back in the mid-1990s. Now, if you're wondering where all these people were and are living, I'll tell you, they're back at home. Millennials are not only delaying buying their first home, but they're also staying in their parents' homes longer than prior generations, with the share of young adults living with mum and dad up from 10.6% in 2000 to 16.8% in 2019. And that tells me there's roughly 3.6 million more young adults now living under their parents' roofs. So the question then becomes whether millennials will move out of mum and dad's and buy homes, or won't they? Well, there are diverging opinions about this too. There are some out there who would argue that millennials have a lower desire to become homeowners, and they generally cite two reasons. One, mobility. Millennials don't want to be tied to a home as they're more likely to move more frequently for work than previous generations. And two, personal experiences with the past housing crisis, and that's putting them off. You see, even if almost all of them were too young to be homeowners when the housing bubble burst, many millennials watched their parents suffer through it, with many losing their homes, and this scares them. But there are also others like myself who believe that millennials, well, it's diversity that's holding them back, but they will buy. They do tend to marry later in life than prior generations, and marriage and children are both crucial lifestyle triggers when it comes to buying a first home. But it's also not as simple as that. You see, I believe that, like their predecessors, a majority of millennials really do view home ownership as an important life goal. In fact, a 2019 survey of 10,000 millennial home renters that showed a full 88% of them believing that home ownership is still part of the American dream. But millennials certainly do trail their generational predecessors in the pursuit of home ownership. So which is it? Will they become buyers or won't they? Well, I pulled some data from a survey that was undertaken last year by Apartment List, and it contains some fascinating insights. You see, when you ask millennials about home buying, well, their responses affirm my opinion, rather than those who think that millennials are and will remain perma-renters. You see, the lifestyle benefits of renting, well, they are dwarfed by the burden of, you guessed it, affordability. Among millennial renters who plan to buy a home, a full 70% are holding off because they can't afford it. And that compares to just 33% who say they're not ready to settle into a more permanent lifestyle. And similarly, among renters who don't ever plan to buy, 69% say they will always rent because they can't afford to buy, compared to just 40% who cite the benefits of a more flexible lifestyle. So my take is that while the lifestyle benefits of renting do play a role in their decision-making processes, millennials are renting longer because they have to rather than because they want to. And with finances being a deciding factor, it was also interesting to see how they were coming along with saving for a down payment. And as this shows, they're not doing very well. And what stood out to me, and I'm sure you too, was that almost half have nothing saved at all for a down payment, and only 13% had more than $10,000 saved up. But as stark as this sounds, it's actually not surprising. You see, many renters, and especially those in larger metropolitan areas, have seen their rents rise precipitously over the past several years, and they're stuck. They can either pay the rent or add to savings. Many can't do both, and this is holding a lot of them back. So what are they doing to get onto the housing ladder? Well, that's right. Welcome to the bank of mum and dad. But even those who looked to their family for help last year, well, they didn't get as large a check as those that asked the year before. And this is a massive problem. Millennials face a housing market where rents and home prices are growing much faster than incomes and have done so for decades. And this is leaving millennials struggling to achieve home ownership. And even college-educated millennials, who tend to have higher incomes, well, they're struggling to save for a home due in no small part to the increasing burden of student loan debt. So we know why home ownership rates have declined among young adults, but this also raises the question of possible long-term economic consequences for the millennial generation. You see, the decision to delay forming households and become homeowners, well, that's going to have significant impacts on their ability to build future wealth. As millennial families get older, well, they're going to have fewer financial resources available to access after retirement, and that can potentially weaken their own economic stability. And another issue is that wealth created through home ownership, it's normally transferred from parents to children. But if there's a significant delay in buying, or if they don't buy at all, well, there's likely to be less to pass on to the next generation. And that can simply reinforce the wealth inequality issues that we face today. Ultimately, it's my sincere belief that home ownership remains very beneficial for most families, offering both financial gains and a chance to build wealth over time. And I believe that this is not lost on millennials. But don't think they're not buying, because they are. In fact, first-time home buyers started out 2020 really rather strong, with a purchase of 456,000 single-family homes. That's up 14% from a year ago. And they're certainly benefiting from improved housing affordability because mortgage rates are so low. But they're not going to stay low forever. Now, of course, COVID-19 hit housing in April. First-time buyer activity dropped by almost 30% in just 1 month. However, we also saw a very quick rebound in May of almost the same magnitude. You see, repeat buyers were more impacted by COVID-19 in April than first-time buyers, in part because their purchases often are contingent on completing sales of their current homes. That's obviously a hurdle that first-time buyers do not have. Ultimately, I believe that most millennials want to and will buy homes. But as I hope to have demonstrated, well, they do have issues. But believe me when I tell you that they are going to be a significant component of the US housing market for many years to come. And they would be even bigger if we were to build more housing at price points that they can afford. Well, time never stops and millennials will get older, whether they like it or not. And guess what? Well, I've already got my eye on the next generation of home buyers. Yep, Gen Z. Well, they're currently in elementary school, but some are old enough to be in college. And there's 67 million of them. They have already distinguished themselves in several ways. One, they are already on track to be the most highly educated generation. Secondly, they are more also likely to grow up in rented homes than any earlier generation. And three, they're the most racially and ethnically diverse generation ever. Of course, what remains to be seen is how Gen Z will interact with the housing market as they come of age. You know what? Maybe I should make this a topic for Mondays with Matthew in about 10 years' time, and we'll take another look at them. As always, if you've got any thoughts about this subject, or if you have a question you'd like me to address, I would love to hear from you. In the meantime, take care out there, and I hope that you'll join me again next week. Bye now.